breakfast. Call the Commissioner. Put your calls to Cressida Dick now. 0345 6060 973. This is LBC.
Good morning to you. It's 3 minutes after 8 on Tuesday, March the 5th. Other stories coming up later in the hour, but let's turn to the biggest story today. And, well, barring a terror outrage or a bomb, it's probably just about as grim as it can get. Pictures on the front pages of a number of your newspapers. Knife crime crisis, war zones on our streets. How many more, Mrs. May? One newspaper saying 27 teens all stabbed to death in just a year. Not all in London, I hasten to add. Not all in London. And a picture of too many young faces staring out from too many of our front pages. And I imagine few feel it more keenly, aside from their parents, friends and loved ones, the Met Police Commissioner Cressida Dick, who's in the studio with me now. Commissioner, we saw what happened in London over the weekend. Yes. We see, sadly, that there seems to be a growing picture. Your reaction?
Well, firstly, the events of the last several days in London and nationally, I think, are absolutely ghastly. The murders of 2 teenagers over the weekend have clearly shown just how big a challenge this is. I think people realise now that this is not, as you say, a London-only problem. Indeed, by many measures, some other cities have more challenges than we do in London. It's been my priority since I started as Commissioner to reduce violence and in particular to bear down on violence on the streets and violence as it affects our young people. I've been on your show so many times, Nick. I've never not talked about this as my highest priority. It remains so. But we all need to pull together. I don't think we're failing. I think my people are working incredibly hard. We have increased our operations over the last many months, indeed over more than a year. We are taking more weapons off the streets. We are arresting more people. We are doing more other disruptive activity, as well as record numbers in the last few years of stop and search. So we're working very hard. It's not just the Violent Crime Task Force, it's all parts of the Met. Everybody is focused on this. Every single death, every single stabbing of a young person is absolutely awful. But I can see, and it sounds extraordinary to say this when, the headlines are full of this nationally this week, but I can see that we are having an impact.
Well, you told me, as you may recall, the back end of last year, we're beginning to see the tide turning. Yeah. We're putting more officers on the streets, not just we're talking about knife and gun crime, not just levelling off, they're beginning to come down. Do you want to review those comments now, Commissioner? Well,
in the context of what's happened, I don't think figures mean tremendously much to people. But since you've asked, if you take the last 12 months and compare it with the 12 months before that, knife injuries of people under 25 are down by over 15%. And indeed even homicides in London. Now these are always, thankfully, relatively small numbers. So they bounce around 20 this year. This time last year there were 29. So I don't take any pleasure out of the numbers at all. But since you pressed me on, are they stabilising or beginning to come down? I think they have been in London. But this is a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge for my officers. It's a huge challenge for our communities. It's a huge challenge for politicians and all the people we work with. And given what is happening nationally, given the horror at what is happening to our young people, we all need to step up. And that doesn't exclude the Metropolitan Police.
And when Mrs. May says there is no link between austerity measures and cuts and the level of crime we're seeing, is she right?
I think if you went back in history, you would see examples of when police officer numbers have gone down and crime has not necessarily risen at exactly the same rate in the same way. But I think what we all agree on is that in the last few years, police officers' numbers have gone down a lot. There's been a lot of cuts in other public services. There's been more demand for policing, and therefore there must be some link. And I have consistently said that there is
Prime Minister is wrong. There is a link.
I agree that there is some link between violent crime on the streets, obviously, and police numbers. Of course there is, and I think everybody would see that. That's why I asked the year before last to get more money and to have more officers, and was given a small amount. This last year I've been given more. So what I'm doing at the moment is recruiting, and I'm recruiting 3,000 officers this year. Now, of course, it'll take a while to get them in, to get them trained, and to get them experienced. But I absolutely agree, and again have said we must have more officers on the streets of London.
So she must reverse her policy.
She has. I don't want to talk about the Prime Minister. The Home Secretary. The Home Secretary has enabled people like my mayor in London to increase funding to the police latterly, and indeed has increased, in some respects, funding to the police in the last few months. I am able to use that money to recruit 3,000 officers this year. Of those, about 1,500 are completely new posts for me. But it still doesn't take me back up to the numbers that we had in 2013-14.
And lastly, before we go to calls, when your immediate predecessor, Lord Hoganhow, formerly Bernard Lord Hoganhow, says nationally we're looking at around 20,000 police officers, is that a figure you recognise and would support?
I do recognise that figure, yes. I haven't done the analysis myself, but it looks like that. Now, clearly there's been some efficiencies, but that scale of drop is a very large number of officers no longer on the streets, no longer able to investigate serious crime, no longer able to prevent crime, which is our first and last function, to try to prevent crime.
So never mind task force or working groups, we need 20,000 boots, men and women actually doing the job up and down the country.
Well, I'm sure my colleagues in national policing, Sarah Thornton and I, will be talking to the government in the coming months about, and indeed there's a meeting later this week with the Home Secretary, we'll be talking about the need, yes, to increase resourcing in policing, as well as a whole load of other measures. I do agree with the comment, and I've said it many times, the police alone won't sort this issue out. We can't arrest our way out of this problem. There are a whole load of other things that need to happen as well, but police numbers are important.
And a knife crime czar is an idea that's been put forward, Commissioner?
Yes, I don't quite know enough about what is anticipated there. I'll be interested to talk to others about that, but I can't say at the moment I think that's the answer. And indeed, I don't think any one single thing, of course, is the answer.
Yes, but does it need personal involvement of the Prime Minister more, to own it, as it were?
I've met the Prime Minister on this subject. I do think the Prime Minister has taken a keen interest in this subject. The Home Secretary has taken a huge interest in this subject, as has the Mayor. I meet with them very regularly on the subject. So I don't think there's a shortage of interest, but we do need, all of us now, to step up and in particular to take a cross-government and cross-agency approach to the prevention, to stop young people getting involved in knife crime and drug crime from the beginning.
And after the last tragic attack in East London, how much contact did you have with London Mayor Sadiq Khan?
Oh, I was speaking to the Mayor very regularly throughout Saturday and Sunday and exchanged texts yesterday morning. So he has been very much in touch.
There's been criticism he went to Morocco. Is it fair to criticise him? Your officer's leave has been cancelled, Commissioner. I
do think that senior people like him work fabulously hard.
So do your officers.
So do my officers.
The Mayor goes to Marrakesh.
Everybody needs some time off, and everybody needs some time off, not just for themselves, but to be good at their jobs.
Would you have taken a weekend off,
I absolutely protect my officers' rights to have annual leave, and I want them to take their holidays wherever they possibly can. I can't answer that question. I don't know what his plans were. I don't know where he was. All I would say is he works very hard. I know he's very focused on violent crime. I work very hard too. I noticed that my predecessor said he thought it was perfectly correct for the Mayor to go away. I suspect that if I'd been on the way to Morocco and I'd heard about this and I'd already left the country, I might carry on. I've got a fantastically strong deputy. I've got a really strong team. They don't need me. But who knows in other circumstances? They need me sometimes. Yes, they do need me sometimes.
Would you put on your headphones, because it's time, but if you put on your headphones to take some calls, they should be by your side. And coming up first, let's go to Richard, who's in Edgware. Richard, you're through to the Commissioner. Go ahead. Good morning to you.
Good morning to you. Good morning, Commissioner.
Morning.
My question actually is, how do you and the police, using your powers and influence, plan on breaking the cycle of knife crime?
Commissioner.
So that's a nice short question, Richard. We have a plan which involves how we prevent people from getting involved in knife crime, how we protect people from knife crime, how we catch knife criminals, and indeed how we deal with the aftermath of knife crimes so that we investigate them properly and bring people to justice. So we've got a broad-ranging policing approach. We have a huge number. In fact, everybody in the Met is focused on various aspects of this. It's not everybody's full-time job, but everybody knows that it's the priority. And I work closely with the Mayor and other agencies in London, because I firmly believe, and I think most people would agree with me, that stopping young people getting involved in drug crime and knife crime involves education, it involves people in communities, it involves families, and it involves all sorts of agencies, not just the police.
Richard, a response. What do you think should be being done that perhaps is not being done, Richard?
If you ask me, even when I listened to your opening conversation, a lot was said about the police, cuts, funding, and that's fine. But I think everybody's kind of missing the real problem here. How do you stop someone who grows up in a poverty-stricken area where there's high crime from engaging in such acts? You know, we say you're a product of your environment, right? Mm-hmm. You know, a lot of the times, 8 out of 10 people who grow up in these areas are very likely to act in the way that they grow up around. If they grow up around poverty or violence or a lack of education, it's very likely that they become aggressive. So I feel as if the main issue here is not necessarily funding the police, but working with the communities, creating more opportunities, making someone who grows up in an estate, maybe somewhere in South London, feel as if that with the right tools, even though they might be a minority, that they can still have the same opportunity as someone who grew up in Ealing. And that's the thing.
And that is the thing. It's a little bit, Richard, please excuse me, sir, it's a little bit, I'm sure the Commissioner is possibly agreeing, it's a little bit out of her remit. She's not, unfortunately, involved in possibly creating unemployment chances, but you paint a very graphic picture. Richard, I'm grateful to you, in fact, the Commissioner is agreeing with you, but I must move on, Richard, for time reasons, thank you. To Croydon, Barry, you're through to the Commissioner. Go ahead, Barry. Good morning, sir.
Hi there, Commissioner.
Hello.
Hi there. What I wanted to find out was if you think there's a link between knife crime and, say, the middle classes, because at the moment we seem to be targeting the symptoms, which is always kind of teenagers, young boys. What are we doing to tackle the actual supply and organised crime within this equation?
Well, that's very important. Supply of drugs and the organised criminals that sit above the gangs, and the gangs on the street tend to be the ones who are bullying, coercing, making young people get involved in drugs. We have organised crime teams who do nothing but dismantle genuinely high-level organised crime networks who are dealing in drugs and in firearms. And we are constantly trying to suppress the supply of both. And of course, we're also trying to send messages to those who use drugs, who may come from, all backgrounds, but not excluding, as you say, middle classes, to point out that they may think this is a relatively harmless thing. It's almost certainly not for their health, but more importantly, from my point of view, it's not in terms of the misery that it spreads amongst our young people, particularly, as Richard said, in some of our most already disadvantaged areas of London, and of course overseas at the point of production. Is misery throughout the drug supply trail.
Quick response from you, Barry.
Well, what I'd like to see is kind of people within these middle classes, not just users, but the actual criminal element of this, because we always see the middle classes almost characterised as just users, but not actually parts of this organisation. And we need to see focuses on this, because we see the disruption of the supply chain. That's what I saw an article on. It said disrupting the supply chain, but actually catching the dealers. I think we need to actually catch the people within the supply chain, because if there's no supply and no source, then you don't get the symptom of dealing.
Cressida?
Absolutely, we need to catch the dealers, and that's why in the last few months I've been telling my teams to target drugs more. It's fair to say, I think, that more than they were over the last several years, and that is because I see the direct link between drugs and violence, and I am very, very concerned about the violence. We have to work, obviously, at the borders as well, and that tends to be the responsibilities, you probably know, Barry, of the National Crime Agency and the Border Force. And it is the case, unfortunately, that it appears the importation of, for example, cocaine into the UK has not been decreasing, it has been increasing. So the demand has gone up, more people using, sadly more people dying, and also the supply has gone up. So right now we're heading in the wrong direction, which is why I have said to my teams, we must do our bit. We can't to solve the whole supply problem, but we absolutely are bearing down on drug dealers on the street and organised criminals as well.
Thank you, Barry. Is it fair to say, Commissioner, that some of these middle-class dinner parties that send out for cocaine on the weekend or whenever it might be, they've actually got blood on their hands of some of the people who are dying on our streets?
I think anybody who, is not sort of seriously mentally ill, seriously addicted, who is seeking recreational, in inverted commas, drugs, particularly Class A drugs. Yes, I think that is a good way to put it. I do. They've got blood
on their hands. These poor people who are dying.
Yeah.
Let's move to other calls. Karen's in Camberwell. Karen, you're on the radio through to Commissioner Cressida Dick. Go ahead. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Nick. Good morning, Claire.
Hello.
I'd like to ask a question. I believe that the police have gone soft on youth crime.
Right. Just in a sentence, what, and you may well be right. We'll hear from the Commissioner. What gives you that opinion, Karen, before I bring the Commissioner in?
Okay, if you're caught carrying a blade, what happens to mandatory sentence? It's a slap on the wrist and let go.
Right. Remember, of course, the police don't actually do the sentencing. We have a different system, and quite a reputable system in this country. Karen, stay on the line. Commissioner.
So, Karen, I am really concerned about the knife crime amongst young people, and indeed some other serious violence amongst young people. And my guys and girls are out amongst them on the streets 365, 24/7. They're talking to them, they're trying to dissuade them from getting involved in drugs and knives, and they are arresting them, and they are bringing them into custody. What happens then? I think it is really important. If somebody is quite young, 12, 13, 14, 15, that attempts are made to divert them away from a criminal lifestyle. But I absolutely agree with you. Where you are, a violent offender, where you are somebody who is prone to violence, then you should be going through the criminal justice system, and this is something I've spoken out about before.
Quick response from you, Karen.
I agree with a few of the previous callers. Lots of things need to be done. We do need more police, and I think going back to the community policing works. If community trust the police, and you make relationships with the community, they're liable to tell you about where these knives are, what the kids are doing. But we need a short-term measure. I think maybe with the pupil referral units, what they've talked about, I believe we should get rid of that system completely, because that's just a breeding ground. You should put in the old approved school system, or them kind of systems that will,
let's put that to the Commissioner. Do you agree with because PRUs, pupil referral units, I read, Commissioner, are almost breeding grounds or hunting grounds for some of these people who are recruited by drug gang or other gangs?
I guess inevitably somebody who finds themselves in a pupil referral unit or excluded from school has probably got some problems or issues already with their behaviours, and that's why they're not in school. They then become quite vulnerable to people who do want to target them. There's just no doubt about that. There is a review going on of the sort of alternative provision at the moment. I look forward to seeing the result of that review. I think what we all know is that there are some excellent pupil referral units, and probably, I'm not an educationalist, some that are very much less good.
So the idea can work.
I think the idea absolutely can work. And we in the Met are actually, not only do we have officers in schools, and later this year I hope we'll have 600 officers in schools, including in schools for younger children, but we'll also have officers, and indeed already do, in the pupil referral units. And the job there is to try to protect the children from getting involved in violence, to divert them away, but also, of course, if they are involved, to make sure they're dealt with effectively.
The 3,000 officers you're seeking to recruit, Commissioner, would some of those go into what was called community policing? Do you have a rough plan where you want to deploy the personnel?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, at the moment, we're looking to... We have a strong commitment to community policing, schools, on the neighbourhoods, and that is, as Karen, the last caller, said, fundamental to building good relationships with people, getting information, getting intelligence. And a lot of the work I've talked about, catching people with knives, dealing with drugs houses, just in the last 2 weeks, my neighbourhood teams have done some fantastic warrants and locked up loads and loads of people. So we will continue to invest in that and make sure that those are up to the numbers they should be. But in the first instance, I'm keeping the officers on our violent crime task force who were dealing with roads policing. I've got not everybody who's dealing with roads policing, but some of the roads police officers are staying on the violent crime task force, and I'm putting the new officers as they come in, obviously into training. But that allows me to put people on boroughs specifically to target violent crime.
Let me play you something the former Defence Secretary, Conservative Sir Michael Fallon, told my LBC colleague Tom Swarbrick that possibly, have a listen to this, Commissioner, you should call on the Army.
They're always there in support of the civil power if troops are required, for example, to be involved in large-scale searching of woods or cordoning off railway stations or whatever. Local police commanders know in the end that if they need numbers of trained people and they haven't got enough police officers, they can rely on the military to help and call on them.
Hearing that you're recruiting 3,000, and obviously if you get more cash you'll recruit more, but in the interim, is there a role for the military, Commissioner?
We do work really closely with our military colleagues, and as you know, in sort of civil emergency or real crisis, for example, in counter-terrorism, we do use military colleagues' assistance quite a bit.
Is this a crisis that would warrant military assistance?
I find it hard to imagine how I could usefully call on my colleague next door in the building next door to my headquarters, the Chief of the Defence Staff, and say, could I have military on the streets of London or use them in particular roles at the moment. But I don't exclude it. I really don't. I do think we all need to work together on this. And if there are things that the military would offer for us, then of course I would think about it. Not to carry out policing functions, but as Sir Michael says, other supplementary functions.
We're moving on to another area in a moment with Niran. Just before we leave this area for now, Commissioner, when Trevor Phillips, who of course was Chief of the Equality Commission, says gang violence will be reduced only if the government admits it largely affects black people. Is he right?
This is a subject I've talked about a lot, Nick. It's absolutely clear that knife crime homicides, for example, knife crime under 25 in London, hugely affects our black and minority ethnic communities and young people. It just does more than other communities. So that is, as victims, horribly high levels. 62% of homicides last year were people of African Caribbean origin, and also
is this in London?
In London, yeah. And also as not just victims, but also as offenders, and a huge amount. Yeah, it's actually, I think, slightly higher when you look at knife crime under 25.
Right.
Now, it's not. This is a London phenomenon. I can't speak for the rest of the country, and I think you'd find different things there. But I have consistently said this, and when you look at our gangs, absolutely, there is a much higher involvement in gang activity, and it's not just the police that would say this. Children's services would say it, sadly, from boys of African and Caribbean origin than others.
And why? Is that people talk about absentee fathers? Is that an issue in the community?
I think it's far more complicated than that. And I think if we went back to our first questionnaire, there is a real issue about people growing up in an area where they are exposed to influences of their older brothers, their uncles, their whoever, and not, of course, exclusively African Caribbean, but in that area, an awful lot of people who are involved in crime or have been involved in crime and are encouraging others to get involved in crime. It breaks my heart, Nick, because I've worked as a police officer in this city for 35 years on and off, and I can take you to streets that I patrolled, in my very much younger days, and you can see how little, in some respects, things have changed. And again, I could take you back. That's not just a policing issue.
Let's go to other areas, Commissioner. Niran is in Edgware. Niran, your question to Commissioner Cressida Dick. Good morning.
Good morning, Commissioner. Good morning, Nick.
Hello.
Hi. In recent years, we are seeing a rise in anti-Semitism, physical, verbal, and online. Now, according to the statistics of the CST, the Community Security Trust, last year there was a rise of 16%. On 2017.
Yes.
The question is, what is the police doing to protect the Jews in the UK?
So we in the Met have a very long history of working very closely with our Jewish communities, and as I said just last week, we are proud to do that. We know that Jewish communities, for a whole variety of reasons, can feel quite fearful. World events we've seen some awful things, not least Pittsburgh in the last year, that really reverberate and resonate for our Jewish communities in London, despite the fact that London, remains a very safe city for most people most of the time, and that absolutely includes people in the Jewish communities. We take a zero tolerance approach to anti-Semitic crime, And we are working night and day with, for example, the Community Security Trust and other organisations and other people in the communities to make sure that we understand what's going on, that we're getting good information and intelligence, that we respond really quickly if something does happen, and that we investigate as well as possible.
Does the domestic political horizon affect some of these instances, do you think?
Well, the vast majority of the incidents are not crimes, and where someone is feeling that's an unpleasant thing somebody's just said to me, an uncomfortable thing somebody has just said to me, that is not a crime of itself. Those that are crimes, the vast majority are not violent crime. They are, words. They're online words or criminal damage. I don't take away from how hard that can be for the victim. Sometimes it's really, really hard. I think there's little doubt that a whole variety of things have contributed to there being more, not least social media, there just being more kind of
the problems with the Labour Party,
background noise, background words which are unpleasant and rise. And my colleagues have talked recently, as you know, Neil Basu has talked about, the rise of the extreme right wing and the terrorist threat from the extreme right wing has undoubtedly gone up a bit. A whole load of things have contributed to that.
Thanks for that, Nireen. Must get at least one more in, Clive in Hastings. Clive, you're on the radio. Good morning.
Good morning, and good morning to you, Commissioner.
Your question, Clive.
Should we allow the not Jemima, Mrs. Begum, the lady
Shamima Begum, the East London schoolgirl, who's currently
should we allow her back to what is the Commissioner's opinion, please?
Shamima Begum, the runaway jihadi bride, currently in a refugee camp in Syria. What should happen to her?
So my opinion in these circumstances, I'm afraid, Clive, is neither here nor there. I'm a professional police officer. My job is to deal with her if she comes back. It's a decision for the government, for the Home Secretary, as to whether she can come back. Well, I'm not going to go into any more detail about her circumstances. But if a person comes back to our borders and they've clearly been involved in Syria, we will always detain them, we will always talk to them, we may well arrest them, and if there's sufficient evidence, we'll bring them to justice.
And when you say deal with her, what does that mean in detail? I appreciate you, but as a professional police officer, what does that mean? You monitor her?
So, as I've said, when she arrives at the port, or an individual who's been in Syria arrives at the port, we have a plan. We always have a plan. We have a plan for them, and we'll have a plan for their family as well. And we will talk to them. Now, it depends what evidence we've got. It depends what intelligence we've got. And I'm not going to tell you what we've got in this particular case, obviously.
You've got something.
But we would always talk to somebody coming back from there, and subject to the intelligence and the evidence, we will then potentially.
Do you have something in this?
I'm not going to talk about that. We will potentially arrest the person, and we will then interview them. And I think many people come back fully expecting to be arrested and to be prosecuted. And we will, if that's the right thing to do, and we can, we most certainly will. If the person cannot be, because there's insufficient evidence, then of course we have to monitor the risk. And there are an unknown number of people who could come back. But
how many have come back, broadly speaking?
I believe. Don't want to get these figures wrong, Nick, but I think it's sort of high hundreds may have travelled. Of them, many will have been involved in humanitarian work, genuinely in aid work, and that kind of thing.
How many have been arrested on return to UK?
I'm not going to tell you the exact number, but I can tell you several people, many, tens and tens and tens of people have come back, and many, many, many people have been processed, and many have been prosecuted as well. I've seen a very small number bandied about, and it's not right. It's in the tens of people have been prosecuted, and we will always seek to prosecute if we can.
All right. One final question before what you and I are doing next week. If Britain were to move in 24 days to a no-deal Brexit, what precautions have the Met needed to look at?
We've been looking at this for very, very many months. On the one hand, we need to look at how we will work with our European counterparts in different countries in order to keep London safe, because some of the what we call instruments and laws that we currently work with won't be in place anymore. So, for example, how we arrest people and move them across the continent quickly. Some of our access to intelligence databases, that kind of thing, they won't be there, so we'll have to find other ways of dealing with things. Secondly, we are, of course, looking at the potential for whether people will want to come and protest.
Yes, civil unrest potentially.
And that's the job we do all the time in the Met. And, it's probably, I have to say, almost nobody in the world as good as my officers at dealing with protest, and we will get on with that if there is protest. And then finally, if we need to help where, if there's talk of things like, food queues and that, and more to the point,
drugs,
problems with particular issues, yes. If that were to be the case, and I think there's all sorts of ifs and buts there, then of course the police stand by to make sure that people are kept safe.
So all that's in the planning stage?
Absolutely. We've been planning carefully with authorities across London and with the government.
While it's always a pleasure to see you, I have a privilege of doing something with you next week regarding the men and women who serve under you. A word on that, Cressida Dick.
Next week we have the Met Excellence Awards. That's where I and Nick get the chance with others
the Commissioner. That's all I do, and the men and women
congratulate the fantastic men and women of the Met. They're all fantastic. They all do extraordinary work. These are some of the very best of the very best who've done something utterly extraordinary. In particular, we have one category which is for bravery. There are 3 finalists in the Bravery Awards, and the public can vote in that. Okay. So if they contact the Met, they can
Details
vote.
On the Met website.
Absolutely.
Okay, Cressida Dick, thank you for appearing on LBC. I look forward to that date next week.
Thank you so much for doing it, Nick. Thank you.
Thank you indeed, Commissioner. On LBC, when news is next.
The Met Police Commissioner has insisted on LBC that the force is not failing to tackle knife crime.
My people are working incredibly hard. We have increased our operations over the last many months, indeed over more than a year. We are taking more weapons off the streets. We are